Hello, everybody, and welcome to this special conversation with the cast and crew of Operation Mincemeat. I'm Dave Karger from Turner Classic Movies, and I'm absolutely delighted to be able to introduce 7 members of the cast and crew of this wonderful film. So we have with us 2 of the producers, Ian Canning. Hi, Ian.
Hi there. How's it going?
Great. Chris Tickier is with us. Hello, Chris.
Hello.
The screenwriter, Michelle Ashford. Hello, Michelle.
Hello.
And 3 of the cast members, Kelly MacDonald. Hi, Kelly.
Hi.
Matthew McFadden. Hello.
Hi.
And Colin Firth. How are you?
Hello. Hello. How are you?
And the director is with us as well, John Madden. Hello, John. Great to see you.
Hi, Dave.
Before we talk about the film itself, this movie represents many different reunions of different people who have made wonderful projects together in the past. Colin, obviously, Ian Canning and his producing partner, Emil Sherman, produced The King's Speech through Seesaw Films, their company. And it had been about a decade, I think, since between these 2 films. How much had you stayed in touch, Colin, with Ian and Emil in the hopes of doing something together again?
We haven't altogether lost contact, have we, Ian?
There was pigeons sent with notes and things like that, wasn't there, over the years?
We had I don't know if you can call it a habit when there are intervals in between, but we were tending to approach each other with ideas. I think in this world, 10 years isn't actually bad going. In terms of finding the next thing.
10 years between Second World War films, I think, is probably appropriate. That's probably the timing.
That makes sense. And to prove your point that 10 years is impressive, think of how long ago it was, Colin, that you and John worked together on Shakespeare in Love. I mean, that's over 2 decades. Was that a nice reunion as well?
It was very nice. John and I think we've had more contact, not least because we live about 3 doors away from each other. If one of us has an idea for the other, it was hard for anybody to, avoid. I've made this attempt a number of times, haven't we, John?
We have. Yeah, it's like lobbing a script over a fence, basically. And we've been sort of done out of it on several occasions, having to do with schedules and so on. But this one came good.
And then, of course, John and Michelle, you have the history together from Masters of Sex, which Michelle created. So I imagine there must have been a dialogue, Michelle, continuing between the 2 of you.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We became good pals when John graciously directed the pilot. Yes. And then
This is what she gave me, actually, when we were just about to start shooting the pilot of Masters of Sex. She said, "This is a fantastic book." And it says on the front, "If it appeals, I promise you a fabulous script."
modestly, I said this.
And it took us 6 years to get there, but
Yeah. But I did. John and I really hit it off when he directed Masters of Sex. And this book, I had read the book and I thought, oh, I can't think of a more perfect director for this. And so, yes, 6 years later, there we were.
And then, Kelly, what am I leaving out?
Well, Colin can't seem to shake me, poor thing. I think we've been longer than anyone, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
This is, how many times? This is 3, 4?
This is the hat trick. Yeah, this is the third one.
Okay, so I love, John, that you just showed Ben McIntyre's book, Operation Mincemeat. That's kind of the source material for this. Can you tell me how it entered your life and what intrigued you so much?
Well, it entered my life in material form, obviously, from this hardback that Michelle gave me. Was not a story I was completely unaware of, but I had not read Ben's book, which was a pretty extraordinary experience because it's an extraordinary story to start with, and he has a gift really for lifting what could be a kind of dry account of espionage and endless detail into a kind of just an absolutely ripping read. They're full of the most extraordinary characters, and he has a rather mischievous way of telling the story and pointing you at the ironies and the absurdities of the story and the whole idea of it, frankly. I mean, my first feeling when I looked, I said, wow, this is a challenge. I mean, it's a delicious challenge, but a challenge really to kind of accommodate the extraordinary range of moods and ideas and reversals and characters that it has in it.
And Chris, from your point of view, I know this is, I think, the third film that you've produced that John has directed, so you have a great history with him. What were you most excited to see John bring to this project?
Yeah, it's also a hat trick for me. Look, I spend my life waiting to make films with John. So I to be honest, I would, if I could only make films with John, that would basically be what I would do. I think he has a marvelous way with actors. Three wonderful actors here, but I think he's character driven. He is a tough taskmaster for a screenwriter, insofar as he is incredibly involved in the script. And I think watching him work with Michelle was sort of superb. He's a director who gets under the skin and is both incredibly respectful of writing talent, but is all about script. And we wanted to make a film that was I don't want to say it's an old-fashioned film, but it's a proper movie. We wanted to make a big film that was dramatic and characterful, and I don't think there's anyone better in the world than John.
I want to ask the three actors about their characters, because they're also intriguing in many different ways. Colin, I think what's really interesting about how we learn about you and Montague here is that we almost learn more about his personal life before we learn about his professional life. And I think that's a really interesting way to get an audience invested in the character, even before the plot of the movie, the spy plot, I mean, is set in motion. And I was very intrigued by the scenes early on in the film where we witness him with his wife and family and see the kind of friction there and the dynamics there. What interested you about playing Montague in kind of these two different realms, the personal and the professional?
The personal life of spies is something that has interested me before. I don't know. I obviously not an authority on any of it. Most of us don't know what the personal or professional life of spies is. I think there's a singular difficulty in which you can't, if you're doing something secret, you can't share it, with your family. You can't come home and describe your day at the office. And I think that puts a particular pressure. I mean, I've actually spoken to people who've had to do, I've actually quite recently played another Navy officer whose work couldn't be shared. And, I think it clearly puts a lot of pressure on everybody concerned. There's a line in Tinker Tailor Soldier's Spy, which Tom Hardy has, when they're trying to persuade him to come back from the cold and do the job. And he says, this line had over all the screenings, this line got a big laugh when they screened it for spies, apparently. They actually showed the film at the MI5 headquarters screening room. And there was a line which got a laugh only in that screening and nowhere else, which is, he said, if I do this for you, I want out. I want a life. I don't want to end up like you lot. And it brought the house down, because it hit a spot with that particular audience. That didn't get a laugh anywhere else. And so I think that's just the clue as to, I think, the sacrifice and how painful it must be. And I think there was something that in our story, it was important to kick off with that, just the personal investment and the personal sacrifices that spies have to make. And also, it is a profoundly personal story. I mean, it's, it's about a corpse who is also a human being, and all the moral questions that circle around that.
Matthew, I was really intrigued by Charles Chomley, and he's this man who is very dedicated to his work, but he also has these other pressures coming at him. He is kind of asked to spy on his own coworker, but he seems conflicted about it. What struck you about playing those different sides?
It's just great. I enjoyed all that. I mean, he's sort of he's incredibly bright. I mean, deeply, deeply clever, Chumley, but terribly socially awkward and sort of quite lonely, and that was fun to play. And the sort of the conflict between the sort of triangle between Colin and Kelly's character and me was sort of worked very nicely with all that, with the backdrop of this awful pressure of the operation and everything. So yeah, it was great. It was great. It's really interesting what Colin's talking about. There's no reflected glory even for them. You know, they couldn't, not only could they not speak to their families about it, but there's no sort of sense of sort of strange thing that spies go through. And I don't think Chumley ever spoke about it ever, or Montague, to anybody.
And Kelly, Jean, your character Jean, I think is maybe the audience's way into the story, because I just find her so relatable. She's someone who is ambitious, but is able to navigate the world of her job in a way that doesn't feel super ambitious. She does it with charm. And I found that really interesting, that she has the wherewithal to get in the room, but to do it in a way that feels right. What did you love about her the most?
I loved exactly what you're saying. I loved how vital she was and charming, and I think from Ben's documentary, it was interesting actually to hear about these women that worked in MI5 and how they all, you know, it became this passion. Everybody wanted to be involved in this story and sort of to sort of bring something to the table. And so Jean's character is kind of, I think, an amalgamation of a few of those women. And she got the prized sort of, you know, she got to be the photograph and the wallet litter. And I think it was like winning a competition or something. I'm in the office.
Michelle, did you get a sense in your research of the script when you were learning about the women who worked on this mission and in these organizations in general? For someone like Jean, a character like Jean, what would the bigger obstacle have been? The status of her position, what level she was at, or her gender? Which would be harder to overcome in a way?
Well, you know, women played actually a very vital role in the war, but especially in this area of espionage, and all the women that were working at Bletchley decoding. And what was interesting is because so much of this was hidden, I think in a way it allowed women to attain more kind of status and position in these operations, because so much of it was not known. And so in a weird way, without being in public view, I think women got to do more and be involved more in these operations than they would have been if it was all on the up and up. And I thought that was fascinating. And the women involved, I mean, there's so many wonderful stories about women that were vital to war effort operations, and a lot of them are untold.
Ian, when you think back to this production, what do you remember as being kind of like the biggest logistical challenge? Was it scheduling this sprawling cast that I'm sure was pretty busy because you shot this all pre-COVID? Or was there a particular set piece or a department that required a lot of your attention?
I guess we did have to ultimately, which I guess was my fault because it was my idea, that we had to do the landings on the beaches. So from my perspective, that was a sort of an essential part, because the story is so much about the intelligent private people in the private rooms, but actually what they were responsible for was from such a ludicrous idea to something that they achieved that was so spectacular. It really needed to sort of land that kind of, I guess, the peril that all of those guys went through when they hit the beaches. So I would say that was recreating that within our sort of limited budget was something that was important.
John, how would you rank those beach scenes as far as just the scope of it compared to, you know, and anything else that you've done? Where does that rank?
So when you get to the very last part where, you know, this is something that was going to happen anyway, this invasion, it was somehow we didn't really have to work at it. I mean, obviously there was a huge scale issue involved in it. We took over unfortunately not a Sicilian beach, but a beach in South Devon, which was a huge landscape with a, you know, massive lighting rig. I remember the production head of production at Seesaw said, "Wow, you got a lot of kit here." You know, we had huge movers and you know, Caterpillar machines and everything all over the place. So that itself was, it's sort of, you know, when you get to those places, it's like doing the fifth act of a Shakespeare play. You know exactly how to play it if you got the first four acts right. And the stakes were so clear and so felt, I think, even by the guys who were running up and down the beach, you know, countless times in freezing temperatures. So it was, it was a challenge, but it was a good challenge.
Matthew and Colin, the relationship between your characters is obviously very fascinating and multifaceted because they are teammates, if you will. But then there's this suspicion. They're even competing for the same woman. What was that like to play, Colin? All those different levels and layers of the relationship at the same time.
As you say, the intrigue is layers of an onion because there's a intrigue within the intrigue. They ask, you know, there's the enemy out there, and then, you know, the conflict that then develops between these two characters. And they're keeping secrets from each other, and there's espionage in their relationship. Not just secrets, but betrayals. And, you know, it reminds you of just how many fronts this war is going on in. You know, there's the obvious ones, that in this case, they're fighting the Germans, and then Russia, which is an ally, but still to be suspected, you know, by the high command. And one's set to spy on the other. And of course, you know, my character has a brother who was, in fact, loyal to Soviet Russia, and something that they foresaw would be a problem later. And then it's the deceptions that they play on each other over the romantic side of things. But then is it their own character, or are they competing to inhabit this construct as a real person, which is quite interesting for us as actors, because in a way they're doing it's rather like they were making a movie.
They have to sort of pick it to pieces intellectually, but they also, it's, you know, they feel that they inevitably fall into it emotionally and try and get into it like an actor with a part, you know. So that was a lovely sort of melding of the two.
The idea really that sits at the center of the whole film and the center of the story is a fiction. It's a fiction that is created on which an enormous amount depends. The inevitably, as the story unfolds, the line between fact and fiction, between truth and fiction, becomes ever more difficult to discern, particularly for the people in it. And they disappear into their own fiction. I mean, that's literally what happens. And not surprisingly, you know, and there are analogies, obviously, in the making of a film. Similar things happen or have been known to happen. And actually that sort of intensifies the experience of making it. But Michelle was very, very alive to the idea that sits in the material as well, which is that, you know, as Matthew's character observes all the time, everybody seems to be writing novels. And the 20 Committee, which was the heart of wartime espionage, was literally bursting at the seams with novelistically inclined, you know, crossword puzzle solvers and detective fiction writers. It was quite extraordinary. So that the whole idea of the creation of fiction and storytelling is this unseen current in the whole film.
I love the idea of having the character of Ian Fleming, future James Bond, narrate this film. And I also love his inclusion because it allows for these moments that a James Bond fan will love, where you kind of see the gears turning when he sees a gadget. Or when did that idea come to you as being a structural framework for you?
Well, in terms of the structure, that was something that John and I were talking about for a long time. So his narration came about late in the game. But when I read that book, one of the main things I was drawn to was the fact that Ian Fleming was the architect, one of the architects of this plot. And I thought, that is brilliant. I mean, honestly, the fact that the guy who created James Bond was at the center of a real spy story that he created. And then that led to him going, wow, this is such a fertile area. I'm just going to start writing about it. I just thought that was just fabulous. And And as John said, so many of the people who worked in real life in these spy operations were writing spy novels. It just showed that the grip of spy stories on us. I felt that Ben's book was a Valentine to spies and spy stories and how they have such a grip on us. From, James Bond, Austin Powers, to we just keep coming back to this material because it really grips us somehow. And I felt that his book was a Valentine. So I loved that Ian Fleming was at the center of this. And then the more John and I were talking about it, we thought, well, from the man who ended up writing, you could argue, the definitive spy stories of our time, let's make him tell this story. And that seemed really fun to us.
Matthew, would you say your scenes with Colin were one of the highlights for you?
It's very difficult when someone drinks in the morning. But
it's also the highlight in certain ways.
It was joyful. I hadn't worked with Colin before. I worked very happily with Kelly before, also with an enormous moustache.
What, you had the moustache, Matthew?
I had the moustache. Both times I had the moustache. No, it was a real thrill. It was a real thrill. He's a supremely lovely man and a supremely brilliant actor. And so it was very nice. We both played one part, a Jane Austen part, so that we had that connection. Colin's much older than me, so I'd watched him. In all seriousness, I'd watched Colin in things like Tumbledown and Month in the Country when I was forming the idea of maybe going to drama school and the idea of maybe trying to be an actor. And so it was quite a formative experience watching him in those things. And then so to work with him all these years later was lovely.
Since you mentioned it, Matthew, was there any discussion on the set of this film that, Kelly, you were essentially choosing between two Mr. Darcys?
Can I just say at this point, on paper, it's like Jean Leslie, all these men are, interested in her. But the real romance was between Matthew and Colin.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Michelle, I want to ask you and John about the challenges of weaving in the kind of war plot elements of the film among the interpersonal elements. And it's very seamless the way you both did it. And you feel like both sides of the story are getting equal love and you're never feeling like, oh, I want to go back to that. It's always it comes back at the right time. How was that? Was it like almost mathematical to make sure that in the script and in the film that too much time didn't go by or too many pages didn't go by where you weren't attending to one side of the movie?
That took a lot of work. The book is huge and sprawling. And, I certainly had to go at it for a while. And then John joined me in this process. And no, this took a lot of work to figure out how to weave these stories and make it feel seamless, because it was very complicated. And the script did go through a lot of different iterations, trying to get the tone right. As John was saying, when you read Ben's book, it's parts of it are just absolute lunacy, like slipping on the banana peel comedy. And then some, with the enormous weight of a very real world war happening. So that took a lot of work to try and figure out how to get the tone right, what their relationships were like, how to include the humor without, completely derailing the rest of the story. So yeah, it was a complicated one for sure.
The task really was to make sure they weren't alternate. It didn't have alternate values, those two different things. I mean, there was obviously a story that was moving relentlessly forward, which was the creation of this fiction. And the task really was to make both sides, that's to say the personal side, the personal elements that are involved in the creation of that, belong to and point directly at the story that was emerging. That took quite a while to kind of figure out exactly how to do that. But in other words, they sort of weave and braid together. They're not like, oh, well, now we've spent too long in the emotional world, let's come back and deal with some, hardcore espionage. It really didn't unfold that way, and I don't think it did in reality either. So it's really about making them belong to one another. I just wanted to say one shout out that it was an extraordinarily interesting film to edit and to score. The editor, Victoria Boydell, and I worked for a very, very long time remotely from one another, rather like the situation we're in here, about 150 miles apart and never in each other's company. So we were sort of, experiencing the film inch by inch. And then Tom Newman, who wrote the score, became involved some way into that process, but then very intimately involved, because the way musically we weave our way through it, I think has an enormous amount to do with the way the stories, the different aspects of the story cohere.
Chris, one of the things that I love so much about this movie is the depiction of this kind of wartime fabulous social life that we get glimpses of in this movie, these supper clubs and all these, just it's so antithetical to what you think would be going on during a war. When you think back to the actual production, what were some of the challenges in making sure that felt right and authentic, but also pretty fabulous?
Actually, one of the things that was really tough was to do Blackout London, and to do a London that was much dirtier and seamier and blacked out than it is now. It's interesting. I hope we've been successful, but quite a lot of Second World War movies look great, but all the buildings are bright and shiny white because everything's been cleaned over the last 50 years. Whereas actually at this time in the war, everything was dirty, not just from war, but from the 100 years that preceded it, and sort of coal and dirt. So it was challenging to do that Blackout London, and then it was wonderful to be able to sometimes open the door, as they did in 1943, into this sort of underground world, not just the underground world of Room 13 and the spooks themselves, but actually this social life where the people who were in London at that point, the war was going on, but it was quite far away. So although they were, I think Kelly says it in the movie when she says, we're like moles, this idea of sort of wandering around town with little lights, not being able to sort of, and scurrying, but then actually having an exciting time in their social life. I think, again, also to Michelle's point, it was quite a sort of interesting, sexy time because, there was, strangely, women were being given opportunities and jobs that they wouldn't have had. There was a sort of world where some of the sort of slightly more staid mores of the pre-war years were being wiped away because people were under pressure. So that was super exciting. The Gargoyle Club is, in fact, the original Gargoyle Club is is now where there is a Soho House in London. So the Dean Street Townhouse in London Soho was originally the Gargoyle Club in the 40s, and so although we didn't take many cues from that, it was quite fun to sort of imagine that's a similar sort of crowd and atmosphere for the 40s were there. So it was exciting.
Ian, am I right that you all wrapped kind of just in time in March of 2020?
Yeah, I think there was that sort of, I was back in London. I remember chatting to Chris on the phone and Chris saying, I think we're going to come back to a very different London, aren't we? And I said, I think you are. And then literally that changed in the next 3 or 4 days. It felt like a sort of a tide, a sort of that was coming towards us. And it was like, would you be able to safely get to the end and complete the film? So yeah, there was definitely drama around that. It felt like the world was changing around us as we were coming to the end of the shoot.
It feels like Operation Mincemeat was the last job before the world changed forever, kind of thing. And it sort of has made it even more, we had such a ball. We just had the best time. Like, I've never had a better time, I think, just sitting around in strange sort of dusty old rooms and directors' chairs with a bunch of actors.
Colin, I want to ask you and Matthew about the humor in the film, because it's throughout, and it's something that you wouldn't necessarily think you would find in a movie when you hear about this movie, but it works. And I'd just be curious to know how you and Matthew and John and you all kind of talked about it and played it to make sure that it felt appropriate, but also funny enough to still be these moments of levity.
I think John alluded to it a bit, and which is why Michelle's script's so brilliant, is that it's the amateurish and the amateurishness of what they were doing was sort of is part of the seriousness as well, and the absurdity of it,
I think Michelle caught this absolutely brilliantly, and because it's also, you know, humor can be very specific to a culture. It could be, I don't know, certainly, you know, British culture can be, of that era, can be seen as quite specific, but it could be different depending on class. For all I know, the Air Force has a different sense of humor from the Navy. But I think that it's how you handle things. So if you're in extremis, or you're frightened, or the stakes are incredibly high, it is possibly your only recourse, you know, particularly if there's been conflict between the two people concerned. So when you get things like, I may vomit with you, it's from that part of you that's going to vomit, you know, they mean it. But what else can we say? And now we've done everything we're going to, and all we can do is wait to see if, you know, civilization is going to be saved or not.
There's a sort of desperation that underlies a lot of the humor, and like any humor, you know, you just have to play the reality of it. It's not like, well, let's have some gags now because this is a tough story for people to stomach. I mean, it isn't. It's just the way the story unfolds. And if it's working, it pulls an audience into a relationship and an understanding of that.
Ian, how did the Netflix of it all come about?
Netflix came, we were in post-production. You know, as John said, during the pandemic, we had John editing from one room, and then Victoria like on a washing machine editing her bits. But Netflix came in. I guess we had made a sort of longer promo that had got out into the sort of business, you know, industry, and so therefore we started to get calls, and then it went from there. But they've been very passionate supporters of it, so it was good to get them on board and so passionate about it in the US.
Colin, let me finish with you. I feel like this is such a great only in England kind of story. I don't know if you would agree with that. And I also know that you've been away. I think you're in the United States. You're filming this HBO show that you've been doing for a while. I don't know if it makes you feel homesick watching this movie or talking about it or thinking about it, but it really does seem like a quintessential only in Britain kind of story. Does it strike you that way too?
One of the things that this touched on for me was that World War II was not a foregone conclusion. I know we all know that, but we don't really know it. It was written. It's part. It all feels inevitable that it ran the course it ran. Right now, we're at the end of the generation who lived through it as adults. You know, I think the character of the nation that we're talking about would probably be very different today had things gone differently.
Well, I congratulate you all on making a rousing and massively entertaining. So thank you so much to the whole crew: Ian Canning, Chris Tickier, Michelle Ashford, John Madden, Colin Firth, Matthew McFadden, and Kelly MacDonald. It's so great to be with you all today. Thanks so much.